yet again for another episode of A Push with Lennox. A Push being AP US History and Lennox, well, that's me. And today we're going to talk about sectionalism in the United States between the years of 1848 and 1854. Now, before you can talk about it, you got to know the language. So here we go. This is the terminology you need to be familiar with from this time period. And these are terms most of them you probably know, but some of them you might not know. And so what I would recommend at this point, if there's words you don't know, stop this recording right now. Pause it, push that pause right there and write down those terms you don't know. Once you have them down, go ahead, push play, we'll get going again. And as I talk about each of these items, you can just jot down your notes and you soon will have that terminology you need to be an expert in sectionalism. All right, let's talk about manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was this belief that America had the God-given right to expand from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And we've been doing this since the very beginning. We've had this perception of who we are and this idea to expand from the beginning. And there's a lot of causes for it. And some of them shouldn't be too, surprising. More land, more money, more power. All of that is just ingrained in expansion throughout the entire world. But we also were dealing with the population growth here in America. We had immigrants coming from Ireland and Germany. We referred to those folks as the old immigrants, that first immigration wave that came into our country. They're looking for their piece of the pie. New technology is allowing us to grow more rapidly. You have under the American system, new roads and canals were built to help start moving us west. The railroads are starting to kick in now, so they're moving us west, so it's much easier to move now. And then our English roots. This isn't talked about a lot, but it really played a role in how we settled the West. See, these English roots told us that we were from a superior culture. And being from a superior culture, we have the responsibility to go out and civilize the rest of the world, to elevate them to our level of culture. And Americans kind of had that same attitude as we moved west, as we moved into the wild, untamed wilderness and came across these, quote, uncivilized people. We're going to use our culture to help bring them to the level that we felt they needed to be. And so that's also a cause of manifest destiny. We need to go out there. We need to settle that land. But now let's look at the effects. Now the obvious effects are more land. And a lot of this land came in under James K. Polk. I heard someone say this earlier, and totally true. Polk is the man who put manifest in destiny. And Polk ran on the idea that he was going to complete America's manifest destiny, and he's successful. He brings in the Oregon Territory, he brings in California, and he brings in the Southwest. Now, a lot of people want to give him credit for Texas, but that was John Tyler. Finally, let's talk about the tension that manifest destiny caused. And actually, that's the whole foundation of what we're talking about in this entire presentation. We see this tension between North and South, between free and slave states, start to grow because of manifest destiny. You see tensions start to evolve with the Native Americans because they're getting pushed further and further back on their lands. I mean, they're being pushed further and further onto reservations. And at some point, they're going to start revolting. I mean, the Comanches start to revolt right away. And these revolts are actually going to go not only through the 1850s, but the 1860s, the 1870s, and all the way through the 1880s and 90s. So this is not an easy pill to swallow, or we can't find an easy remedy to it as well. Now let's talk about how this tension affected Americans, though. One of the biggest movements that came out of manifest destiny is going to be what's known as the Free Soil movement. And Free Soilers were Americans who didn't want to see slavery expand into new territories. Now, one thing you really got to keep in mind here is during this time period of our history, most Americans did not have a problem with slavery. Yes, you had the abolitionists, but in all honesty, in the late 30s, early 40s, they were seen as a radical group, kind of on the outlier of society. Most people were fine with slavery as long as slavery stayed where it was. As long as the problem is not in my backyard and I don't have to deal with it, it's all good. And that's kind of what free soilers were pushing for at this point. They believed in free soil, free labor, and free men. And when they looked at territories like the new Mexican ceded land that we got from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, best treaty in the world, and they looked at who would be best at settling that, they were looking at small white farmers, because one of the victims, I guess, of Manifest Destiny is small white farmers. They're being pushed off their land for larger plantations or large cattle ranches, and and wealthy landowners and stuff like that. So free soilers look to the Mexican ceded territories, so those territories of New Mexico and Utah and those areas, as the perfect solution for those small white farmers to be able to move west and start fresh. They didn't think there should be any slavery in these new territories. And because of his small white farmers, there's really no reason for slavery in those new territories. But the Southerners, those slave owners, are seeing this almost as an attack on them. And they're claiming that by restricting expansion of slavery, you're violating the Constitution. And while there is not a direct line about slavery in our Constitution, there were definitely undertones. And there were some real foundational ideas that the Southerners were standing on that were valid. I mean, if you look at Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution, it talks about the protection of property. And if property is removed, that once it's regained, it should be returned back to the original owner. It doesn't say slave, but it absolutely, kind of leans towards that idea. So Southerners, while we might look back in 2020 saying you have no rights at all because you're holding slaves, in the moment, they believed that they had a constitutional right and a constitutional defense to this idea to restrict slavery. And some might be able to make the argument that they were right. The election of 1848 is going to see a three-man race between Zachary Taylor, Lewis Cass, and Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren is representing the Free Soil Party on the idea and the principle that slavery should not expand into the territories. He's going with the Wilmot Proviso. Remember that? That was voted down, but the idea still is alive. Now, he and Cass are not going to have much success against Zachary Taylor. The Whigs were pretty powerful at this point. They were unified. And what the Whigs did in this election is they took no position at all on slavery. They let the other two guys duke it out, and they kind of stood over, and Taylor stood over in his corner and said, you guys, you settle it. And Taylor's going to end up being elected. Right after he takes office, right before, boom, gold is discovered in California. And that's going to send this wave of people out in what we call the California Gold Rush. It's discovered up near Sutter's Mill, which is near present day San Francisco, Sacramento, that area right there. And a lot of people are going out west looking for gold, looking to get rich. We refer to them as the 49ers because it was in 1849 that most of the people went. As the people started moving west into California, California, now an American territory, is starting to push for its own statehood. And they actually draft a constitution. They're going to send that constitution to Congress and appeal to President Fillmore that we should become a state. Here's the problem. Within their constitution, they ban slavery. Now, the argument could be, well, I mean, they're all the way out west. Why, slaves are more centered towards the southern states and moving into the Midwest. Here's the thing. It really wasn't about a question of slavery. And I say this over and over again, and you'll hear this over and over again in my videos. The question of the expansion of slavery was not about the institution about slavery. It was about power in Congress, specifically the Senate. By the time California was applying for statehood, we had an equal balance of slave and free states in our Congress. So that means there were 30 senators representing the free states and 30 senators representing the slave states. It was equal. No one had the upper hand on the other. And when California wants to come in as a free state, the southern states are going to be worried because now the northern states are going to have the upper hand. And the Southerners, honestly, at this point, are starting to get defensive. They feel like they've been pushed, and they said, no matter what happens in this country, the first question that always comes up is, no slavery, stop the expansion. We saw it with, honestly, back in 1787. Now, it wasn't a huge deal then because no one voted against it, but under the Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Ordinance said no slaves in the Northwest Territory. Although what's interesting is Illinois is one of those states that came out of the Northwest Territory. They had slaves. But anyway, I digress. The Talmadge Amendment of 1819, that had to deal with the the Louisiana Territory. While the Talmadge Amendment will not pass, it tried to prevent slaves into that territory. And we're going to end up with the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that divides that land up. The northern part is going to have no slaves. The southern part will be allowed to have slaves. 1846, in the midst of the Mexican-American War, we have the Wilmot Proviso introduced saying, hey, any land we get from Mexico, let's ban slavery. Well, that's going to be defeated as well. On top of that, the Underground Railroad, under the direction of Harriet Tubman, is going to be running in our country, helping escape slaves. And we're going to see thousands of slaves escape via the Underground Railroad. The Southerners obviously are upset because they're losing, quote, property, and no one's doing anything about it. We had laws in place. 1793, we passed the very first fugitive slave law. So we had laws in place on the books that said if a slave escaped and is discovered, it has to be returned back to its owner. But that wasn't happening. It wasn't being enforced. And so while all of this is going on, you have these Southern fire eaters, these radicals who are already calling for secession. They're like, we're out of here. Enough of this. It's not going to change. And honestly, they were probably right. So we'll see. Here's a map of the Underground Railroad. You can see the influence, the extent of where they traveled and stuff. Now, in the early 1840s, going into the early 1850s, most of the slaves on the Underground Railroads were escaping to the north, the northern states. But that's going to change as we get to the 1850s. We have a problem in our country. We have this debate, are we going to let California come in as a free state? What are we going to do with the Mexican ceded territory? What are we going to do with any other expansion territory? And so we're looking for another compromise. And really that's what we've been doing all along, is compromise after compromise after compromise. Go back to the Constitutional Convention. How did we deal with the question of slavery there? The 3/5 compromise, the Atlantic slave trade compromise, where we said we're only going to be part of the Atlantic slave trade up until 1808. Then we get to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Then in 1828, it's not necessarily dealing with slavery, but it's yet another compromise. We have this crisis in South Carolina with the Tariff of Abominations, and the force bill is passed, giving Andrew Jackson the power to take the military down and force South Carolina to collect on this tariff. And Henry Clay is going to step in, which to me, this is one of the most, crazy moments in history where, the southern states were upset about this high tariff. And so they said they're going to nullify it, and everyone's getting all up in arms. And Henry Clay comes up with a compromise who says, hey, why don't we just lower the tariff? But I digress. We need another compromise now. And Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas from Illinois are going to work together to come up with what's known as the Compromise of 1850. Now, Compromise of 1850 has 5 key parts. You really need to know all 5 of these. But if you can know 4 of them, that'd be pretty good. And I'll tell you the 4 you need to know. Number 1, you need to know that California was admitted as a free state. We accepted their constitution. Welcome to the US of A, California. You're a free state. Next, we said this new territory, the Utah territory, the New Mexico territory, the slave question is going to be answered by the people who live there. They're going to be given the power of popular sovereignty, the power to vote on whether or not they want slaves. Next is the slave trade is going to be banned in Washington, D.C. Now, be very, very careful with this one. It's not slavery that's being banned in D.C. It's just the trade. And this was all about optics. You see, the Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, we had a lot of foreign dignitaries coming in there, people visiting and stuff. It just wasn't good optics to see a slave trade or a slave auction going on within the city limits. So they're going to ban the slave trade. Slaves are still going to exist in Washington, D.C. because you do have senators and congressmen and other officials who bring their slaves with them. That's perfectly fine at this point. They just can't buy and sell them. And then finally, or not finally, but next to, the next one is Texas is going to settle its dispute over its border with the New Mexico territory. And basically what's going to end up happening is the land that was disputed, Texas is going to turn that over to the federal government. In exchange, the U.S. government's going to give Texas about $15 million to pay off their debt that has been left over since they were their own country, the Republic of Texas. Now, 3 of the 4 you need to know. You need to know California came in as a free state. You need to know that popular sovereignty was going to be the rule in the new territories. And you need to know that the slave trade was banned in D.C. The whole Texas thing, important, yes, but not vital to your knowledge. Here's the big one, though. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. They're going to take the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 and they're just going to make it stronger. They're going to add some muscle to it. And this is going to cause so many problems in our country. Let's talk a little bit about this. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, like I said right there, increased sexual tension in our country tenfold, because this is what happened. All of a sudden, Northerners who had no problem with slavery, as long as it stayed in the South, were told, if you don't assist when asked in catching runaway slaves in the North, you could be held liable, you could go to jail. Now you are part of the slave trade in a sense, because before, if you saw, the North were like, if slaves escape up here, well, that's their business. It's the business of the South. Well, now we've been pulled into the South's business and we don't like it. And what's going to happen in the North, the northern states are going to turn into this hunting ground for fugitive slaves. If you've ever read the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's what this is all about, is this Fugitive Slave Act and the bounty hunters who are traveling up into the northern states trying to capture runaway slaves. The other thing that the Fugitive Slave Act said was slaves weren't at this point not allowed to testify in court, so there's no way you can prove that you're a freedman or a slave. You were denied jury trials. And so you can see where this is going to cause a lot of problems in our country. And the northern states are going to resist. They're going to fight back. And this is when the abolition movement really starts to grow, because they're like, we don't want to be in the South's business. And the only way we can see to stay out of the South's business is just put the South out of business. So we're going to fight the abolitionists. We're going to fight with the abolitionists. The Underground Railroad is going to expand its reach. And now instead of helping slaves escape to the North, they're going to help slaves escape to Canada. You're going to see states like Wisconsin pass personal liberty laws where they're telling the federal government, you can't use our jails to hold your fugitive slaves. And we're going to require jury trials within our state. And on top of that, you're going to see this rise of vigilance committees throughout the North. These are committees, groups of people who work diligently to protect fugitive slaves and to protect them from the slave catchers. And they put out, posters like this warning escaped slaves that the slave catchers are coming, and this is, you need to keep your eye out because it could happen. And so this is, the North is now saying, we don't want to be part of it, but if we're going to be part of it, we're going to pick this side. We're going to pick the side to help the slaves. So that's, you can see where that's going to cause tension. This cartoon really captures what's going on. It's from the Compromise of 1850, and you can see Henry Clay sitting there. Now, obviously, if we hit this, the historical situation, it's going to be the era of the Compromise of 1850. But let's look at Henry Clay there. Dude, he looks tired, and he probably is. He's been the great compromiser for, 30 years now? It's got to be wearing on him. He's got to be thinking, how many more compromises can we make? And the truth is, not many. You can look at this, and you can see what the purpose of this cartoon. So when we talk about HIP, the purpose of this cartoon is to tell you how inefficient the compromise system was. It never got us a clear-cut answer. It was always leaving someone out. Someone was always getting the short end of the stick. That red line that's going first straight across and then it gets all discombobulated, that represents the Missouri Compromise. And that's kind of what happened. We thought we had it solved. And then once we got more land, it didn't solve the problem at all. Clay's exhausted. The intended audience for this could be either side. Both sides can look at this cartoon and say, we're just not getting a raw deal, because look at this. The idea of these compromises was to maintain an equality of power in Congress. But look at all these states coming in. We don't know. Are they going to come in free? Are they going to come in slave? It's just not there. So what you have to realize, the underlying, foundation of this entire cartoon is what Henry Clay is probably thinking right now. You can't please everybody all the time. It doesn't matter what compromise we come up with, there's going to be someone who's going to be upset. And as long as someone's upset, we're going to keep on this hamster wheel going round and round and round, and this is not going to end. The election of 1852, the Whigs are in absolute disarray. You have the Northern Whigs who are supporting the Fugitive Slave Law, the Southern Whigs who want nothing to do with it, and that's going to divide the Whig Party, allowing Franklin Pierce to win that election. Now, don't let this electoral map fool you. There was not this consensus in America that everyone was behind Franklin Pierce. Now, Pierce was, popular. He was, they called him Handsome Frank. He was a yes man. He tried to please everyone. And so while he's in office, we're going to see that there's going to be some, free soilers who are wondering if they can trust him or not. They're suspicious whenever there's this talk of expansion. And a lot of times I get asked, why did America stop once we got to the Pacific? Why did we stop with, Texas and New Mexico with the Mexican-American War? Why didn't we try to take Mexico too? And here's the thing. This expansion of slavery question actually slows down our manifest destiny, basically grinds it to a halt. Until we can get that question settled, we're going to, bringing more land in is only going to cause more problems. That doesn't mean that we don't still try to expand. For instance, the Ostend Manifesto. There was a group of people in the South who tried to get a movement to buy Cuba from Spain and then possibly turn it into a slave state. Free soilers are going to put this down right away. It's not going to pass. And what they're going to say and what they're going to use the Ostend Manifesto for is to create this fear that the South is trying to create this slave empire, this slaveocracy, where they're going to just start to keep growing and growing and growing until, they've taken over the entire country. A little bit out there, let's be honest. I don't think that was the intention, but it is a fear that's growing at this point. We did expand a little bit. We did what was known as the Gadsden Purchase, and the Gadsden Purchase is this little plot of land that is just south of the New Mexico territory. If you look right here, I'm going to circle it for you. This is the Gadsden Purchase. Now, I've heard some different takes on why we bought the Gadsden Purchase. I'm going to tell you my take right now. It was for the railroad. See, one effect of Manifest Destiny was the Transcontinental Railroad. And that little piece of land there is a nice flat piece of land that would have supported a southern route of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, I've heard other arguments that maybe it had to do with, the nice clean border and stuff like that. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that I don't buy that as the number one reason for giving $10 million to Mexico for that little piece of land. But that's just my opinion. But it's my video, so I can give you my opinion. All right? All right. Moving on. We weren't so isolated here in North America that we didn't try to expand into the world. Maybe not geographically, maybe not politically, but economically during this time, we are trying to expand our country. And we're looking at the Far East, predominantly China and Japan. In 1844, we signed the Treaty of Waikia, and I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, but we signed it anyway. And what that did was it set up diplomatic relationships between us and China. It's going to create a era of trade between us and the country. It's also going to open up China to American missionaries to go into their country and start sharing Christianity. Not to be outdone, in 1854, President Fillmore is going to send Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan, and he is going to negotiate the Treaty of Kanagawa. Now, Japan had been a closed society for about 200 years, and Commodore Perry is going to help open Japan up to the rest of the world. And this is going to be seen as the beginning of trade relationships between us and that country. So while we're dealing with all our drama here, we aren't so focused here that we don't try to go out there. And economically, we're still trying to expand our country. Okay, that's going to do it for our little discussion about this 6-year period, the rise of sectionalism in our country. Coming up on my next video, I'm going to get a little bit more in depth into the 1850s and the timeline leading to the Civil War, and it's going to be a crisis of the Union. Well, we're talking about sectionalism and steps to the Civil War and the Civil War as well. So anyway, that's what I have for you today. I hope you got a little bit of history knowledge. Until next time, we'll see you later. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.